Smith. I'm here with my friend and colleague, Mark Vernon. This is a YouTube live event. It's Friday at 6 o'clock in London, where you're joining from. This is our first attempt, by the way, to do Philosophy Slam in this format. And we've done Philosophy Slam live several times, and we've done it on live several times. But this particular configuration is new for us. So bear with us. If there are glitches and gremlins in the system, please, we beg your forbearance for that. So this, in a way, is a first attempt, a trial run for Mark and me. I'll explain the format in a moment, but let me just introduce Mark a bit more fully. Then he'll introduce me a little bit, I hope, and then I'll say something about how the session will run. So yes, Mark Vernon, Dr. Mark Vernon, man of many parts. He's a philosopher. He is a former priest in the Church of England, and he is a practicing psychotherapist as well. So if you're traumatized during the session, you have an immediate recourse there and then. And he and I worked together actually for many years, I think originally at the School of Life, and then subsequently doing Philosophy Slam and sharing lots of ideas in lots of formats. So pleasure to see you, Mark.
And a pleasure to see you too, Robert. And yes, we normally introduce each other. And I always feel this is useful because Robert, too, has a great interest in matters psychotherapeutic, often from an organizational and group context. I tend to work mostly one-on-one. Robert knows about group dynamics. And also there has a very extensive experience in both business consulting, so can bring the business world to bear on such things, and also a deep knowledge of particularly modern philosophy. And sometimes I think that these philosophy slams have worked in the past because I'm able to bring some sense of things from the ancient medieval world, and Robert complements that with the modern world. And then also these complementary aspects when it comes to the therapy and zones in which we've worked. Although I did freelance for the Financial Times for quite a while actually, so I have some sense of that too. But anyway, the idea is that we together might bring interesting, unexpected, different thoughts or insights from quite a broad cross section, certainly of the Western tradition. Robert.
Exactly. Thank you, Mark. So this is how this is going to run. We've got up to an hour. We won't take any longer of your time than that, especially if it's a Friday evening for you and you're itching to go out on the town. It's Philosophy Slam, and the clue is in the title. There's a bit of philosophy in that Mark and I will draw on our experience of philosophy, but also a bit of psychology and maybe politics or art or things like that. What makes it a slam, really, is that the spirit of this is one of improvisation. And to make it improvisational, that requires you guys online to throw us words, essentially, that we can react to. And now the method, I think, for this is for you to type those words into the chat function. So we're going to see if this works. You can type a single word into the chat. It can be anything. I mean, in the past, we've had everything from, aardvarks to zeitgeist, using an A to Z, and random words like crocodiles, death, they can be very serious. We have had, death, consciousness, memory, and so on. But we've also had extremely silly ones, especially when we've performed at comedy clubs. In fact, not just silly, but also highly bawdy. So that's the idea. Type a word in the chat function. And we've got a first one there already from Simon, value or values. And that's good. Thank you for that, Simon, by the way, because that's the first one that we've seen. James has put in Macrobes. I'll probably defer to Mark on that one. But we've got butterfly as well. That's a nice one. Let's start off with value and values. And I'm going to start off with that, Mark, if you don't mind. You chip in. Of course, it's interesting, as Simon says, value or values, because the two words have completely different connotations, even though they come from the same root, obviously. Because value is that which we value, and often, gets translated into values. But I once ran an event, I remember, for a client, and I asked them what the most valuable thing in the world was. And somebody said diamonds, and with some justification, really, because diamonds are, millions, if not billions of years old. They come from the Big Bang. But in fact, we ended up with the conclusion that the most valuable thing actually is life itself. That was the conclusion that we came to. And then subsequently, I've been reflecting on that. Maybe Mark, you'll have something to say about this too. That even that's a particularly Western perspective. I listened actually recently to one of Mark's conversations with Rupert Sheldrake. Mark does a lot of work with Rupert, where Rupert was remarking on just how relaxed, I suppose, Eastern cultures tend to be about death compared with Western cultures, and perhaps life isn't always considered the most valuable thing in the world. And it's almost as if, I mean, Freud thought this actually. Freud thought that death was a kind of anomaly in human history, and that one day we'd get to a point where we'd sort of edit it out, almost, and we can think of gene editing, I suppose. Maybe cryogenics is a half step to that. But literally as though, death is a kind of aberration. So we value life, perhaps particularly in the West, partly because of an abhorrence um, towards what death is. So that's a kind of starter point. We can come on to values in a second, but I'm sure you've got things to say, Mark, too.
Well, the distinction between value and values has been highlighted by Ian McGilchrist in his recent work, The Matter with Things. And the idea is that whilst people might differ when it comes to their particular values, that there is value shouldn't be doubted. Although in the scientific age, it is put to one side as if it were an optional extra which human beings add to the cosmos. But certainly in the ancient world, it was assumed that reality is shaped by value quite as much as anything else, particularly the values of what's good, beautiful, and true, the so called transcendentals. And that's why in ancient philosophy, in order to do philosophy, who you are matters quite as much as what you're trying to think about or explore, because the value which you yourself inhabit in your life will either open up or close down what you are able to engage with in reality, because reality has value too. So, for example, if you lack certain virtues, that is going to put certain aspects of reality off bounds for you. And in Plato, this is why love is so important, or one of the reasons why love is so important, because love is the longing for more, but it's not just a kind of cognitive more, but it's a throwing your life into more, a desire for the more that you know when you fall in love initially. And then you realize that your capacity to love is blocked as much by yourself as by anything else. And so love has this energy that makes you want to open up, become more expansive, um, even undergo crises of initiation or personal crises, in order that through those kind of breakdowns, a breakthrough might be possible. Love and beauty, particularly, will not let you go. And so nowadays, I think the reason why we can even call into question whether there's such a thing as value written into the cosmos is partly because we've forgotten this subjective notion of how to engage with life, and that which is going on inside us matters quite as much as that which we feel we can stand apart from. But of course, in reality, we can't stand apart from anything. Actually, the subjective and the objective always go together. You feel it just in the energy that someone brings to a subject they're discussing, even if it is apparently quite abstract and dry.
Yeah.
So, value is crucial. Ian McGilchrist is reminding us the ancient philosophers knew. And we engage with value in reality by thinking about the values that we ourselves inhabit. And that matters personally. If you value certain things, then reality will show up for you in certain kind of ways. And if cultures value certain things over others, then aspects of reality will show up to them in terms of what the culture values. And for example, in modern Western culture, the material is hugely valued, maybe more than anything else. And so, funnily enough, not only does culture become materialistic, valuing material things, but matter itself looks like it's the most important thing in the cosmos. But as our values change, because we realize that matter and materialism is just a limited or one cross section of how reality might show up, so I think other aspects of reality will start to re-emerge, or maybe, who knows, different aspects of reality might start to show up for us if our values change enough.
Thanks for that, Mark. Just to say to people, if you've just joined, this works by you entering a single word into the chat function and Mark and I responding to it. So the one we're obviously responding to, the first one we came up was value or values, which Simon put in the chat function. Since then, we've also had macrobes and butterfly, and another one which kind of came and went. So I'm still getting used to the YouTube platform. It doesn't retain the words on screen. So apologies if one came and went. But I want to pick up, and Simon, thanks for your comment there. Funny that in a materialistic culture we throw stuff away so easily. Yeah, it's a very interesting paradox, isn't it? It's valued and unvalued or undervalued at the same time. Kate Allen's come up with lunch like that. Okay, but I just want to go back to, I read the word butterfly. The word butterfly is beautiful, and before I talk about some of the connotations of it, which are profound actually, I learned recently that the English word pavilion, would you believe it, derives from the French word papillon, which is a butterfly. So if you think of the shape of a pavilion, it's supposed to have those kind of sail-like canopies or awnings to shelter people from the sun, essentially. And so that's why a pavilion is called a pavilion, from the French papillon. But the butterfly, I mean, is an extraordinary creature for all sorts of reasons. But the first one, obviously, as in the famous children's book, The Very Hungry Caterpillar, has its origins in something entirely different. And thanks, Rob, for your comment there too. Has its origins in something entirely different, which is a grub. So the butterfly is an emblem, clearly, of metamorphosis. And maybe there's a connection here with value, because if you think of the tradition of alchemy, the practice of alchemy is designed precisely on extracting value from something which is apparently or ostensibly or presents as something quite grub-like, unpromising, out of which one can derive gold. And the butterfly has a sort of similar alchemical quality. It starts as something very, very humble, literally humble, of the earth, and then flourishes, acquires wings, and floats off into the ether as something entirely beautiful. And actually, I think the brevity of its life, the butterfly's life, not only speaks to that alchemical transformation which adds value to it, but the value is then enhanced further through the scarcity of its life, which I think, as I understand, I'm no entomologist, but is pretty brief. So there are two ways in which the butterfly, as it were, secures and amplifies and demonstrates the value of values, and does so, I think, through this sort of miraculous alchemical transformation. And probably, I mean, I'm only improvising here, but I would have thought, and Mark's much more of an expert on this than I am, that when we think of miracles, which themselves are, the ultimate value in a way, that a lot of the value of miracle comes from the act of transformation that seems to occupy the center of it, or that's the sort of motivating agency in a miracle. It's a transformation from A to B. It has an alchemical quality of some kind.
I'm wondering whether that is related to the fact that in ancient Greek, I wonder whether it's so in other ancient languages as well, the word for butterfly is the same as the word for soul, psyche. And I think that must be this ancient perception of how something that could be perceived in what we would call the outer world was known to be the same as something which was felt, perceived in the inner world. And so somehow the way that ancient peoples perceived their inner life, their soul, their inner animation, their inner dynamism, felt deeply connected by sympathy, by resonance and harmony with the butterfly in the world they saw around them. Perhaps it's related to what is sometimes in meditation circles called the monkey mind, the mind that leaps around and is hard to control. So to a butterfly, when it flies through the air, can move actually with extraordinary agility. Agility is the word. And if you've seen butterflies courting, as you can in the spring, you realize that they're not just being buffeted around by seeming currents in the air, but they are dancing around each other as well. So, the mind, the soul, the psyche, the butterfly, so too can link together in dances of love, dances of courtship. So seeing the butterfly on the wing is a way of seeing your soul in life as well. The ancients would teach us. I must just leap back to a previous comment, macrobes. Incidentally, just
I'm glad you're picking that up, Mark. I
just to
wouldn't be able.
just to repeat what Robert did. If you're just joining us, the idea is you put words into the live stream, we'll pick them up, and then they um, enhance and direct, guide our riffing in this philosophy slam. I'm also noticing, actually, Robert, just as an aside, that of course people are putting their own comments and thoughts into the live chat, which kind of adds another dimension to the philosophy slam. Um, Part of the joy of this is that it fosters your own thoughts in a kind of dialogue, virtual dialogue. But to see that coming up in the live chat is rather nice as well for us. But look, let me talk about something about macrobes. I do confess that I googled the word macrobes, and that's one thing you can do online, which you can't do on stage, because I couldn't quite clock where it had come from. But then I saw immediately, of course, it's a C.S. Lewis coinage, I guess, and particularly from his sci-fi trilogy, the third part of that, The Hideous Strength, where macrobes are, I think, if I remember rightly, sort of angel-like creatures that exist between the planets, but they're rather devilish. They wish the human world ill. They are not in favour of the good, the beautiful, and the true, but the ugly, the false, and the damaging. And perhaps, C.S. Lewis, in his very prophetic way, I think that he must have been remaking the notion of demons, the sort of bad angels, and this sense that he had, certainly his friend Owen Barfield, who I'm so deeply influenced by, had, that, well, to link maybe to butterflies and souls, that our souls that influence us are not just our own private personal souls, our own particular life, but also is the life forms into which we're born, our times, our culture. And if you believe that's dynamic, if you believe it does have a life of its own, then why wouldn't it be envisaged as a kind of entity, a kind of being, which we move amongst quite as much as our own particular beings? And so Lewis is using the word macrobe to describe that, and drawing our attention to it, because as is perfectly clear, the minute you reflect on what goes on in life, particularly in the times that can feel troubled, we're not the masters of our own existence. We have to learn how to relate to what's going on and build up ways of both reverencing the wider forces in our lives, but also cooperating and bringing all that we have to bear in order to steer and direct them with our values, with all that is values. Anyway, I
Very good.
think that's right. And uh,
Okay.
develops the conversation anyway a little further. I saw the word emergence,
Yeah.
Robert. I don't know whether, and we mustn't forget lunch, because sometimes it's rather nice talking
Can
about more humdrum things too.
let me jump in on lunch? I just
Okay.
we'll have a lunch break and then we'll come back to emergence. We've got the collective subconscious there as well. So Mark and I are both slightly young nerds, so we can come on to that. Just something on lunch. It made me think of two French sociologists, anthropologists, in a way, cultural theorists. One, Roland Barthes, or Roland Barthes, and another one, Pierre Bourdieu, slightly younger generation. And Roland Barthes was famous really for training his sociological eye upon the everyday features of modern life, particularly modern Parisian life. And one of his most famous essays in the book Mythologies is about steak frites, steak and chips. And he talks about just what a sort of emblem of France that is. And it made me think, the word lunch sounds innocent enough, doesn't it? But if you say the word lunch in France, and particularly compared within England, well, London versus Paris, they have a very different weighting to them, because increasingly in this time-kept city, as T.S. Eliot called it, lunch is a thing that one grabs at the desk. You have a sandwich or whatever on the run. Now we're back from COVID, more or less. That I guess that habit is returning. Whereas, of course, in France, those of you who are French know that lunch is a sort of sacred ritual. Yes, there are, of course, shifting patterns and so on, but still, particularly once you get outside the capital, the idea of taking lunch is a sort of sacred moment in the day. And if you were to apply the thinking of Pierre Bourdieu, who's a sort of critique of the bourgeois way of life, I suppose. I was thinking he's sort of soft Marxist, I suppose. And I did want to sort of say maybe there's a bit of soft Marxism in Simon when he was talking about the work of the grub that's not taken account of relative to the sort of glory of the caterpillar, as though the grub represented the proletariat, whereas the caterpillar represented the aristocracy. But anyway, I think Pierre Bourdieu, thinking about lunch, will probably say, well, yes, one of the reasons why in post-revolutionary France lunch becomes such a symbol is that it's a demonstration of the leisure of the bourgeoisie. They're saying, because lunch for the bourgeoisie is something they would take in a restaurant, but they're not served in their palaces. It's a sign of having enough affluence to take a 2-hour break in the middle of the day, which the French still do, and having the financial wherewithal to afford it, and to relax into conversation, whilst digesting and commenting on the wine, still again mostly outside of Paris. One would still take a glass or two of vin rouge with the meal. So lunch, apparently so innocuous, really a concept. I think once one looks at it culturally, lunch from a British lunch from a French perspective, it's kind of freighted with all of these meanings. Anyway, Mark, that was a brief lunch break I took while you were about to come on to Emergence, which I wanted to comment on after you. Yeah.
Well, let me just say that as you were talking, I wasn't out to lunch. I was listening intensively. So thank you for that. But look, emergence. Yeah. Now, another big word in certain circles, a big coinage and use too. And often when people talk about it, they break emergence down into two sorts: weak emergence and strong emergence. And weak emergence, the idea is that it's something which appears that is new, but you could sort of anticipate from what existed before. So an example might be hydrogen oxide, also known as water. And the thing about hydrogen and oxygen is that whilst they're very different when they're separate from what happens when they combine and make water, both hydrogen and oxygen are very flammable gases. And when they come together as water, they'll actually put out fires rather than cause fires. You can see how that might be so, because the one fiery nature of the hydrogen neutralizes the fiery nature of the oxygen, and so produces something which would dampen fires: water. So whilst water is very different from its constituent elements, it is nonetheless possible to see how the qualities of water are related to what existed before and from which it emerged. But strong emergence is something different. It's when something emerges that really you had no intimation whatsoever that it was going to appear. And an obvious example of this is consciousness, if you believe in the materialist story of the cosmos, where the Big Bang gives rise to basic particles like photons and electrons, that gives rise to atoms that then form molecules, that start to form dust clouds, that form stars, that form higher elements like carbon. You get planets onto which the carbon can settle. And then you get this thing called life. Maybe if you have a mechanical notion of life, that's not quite a strong emergence. But certainly some life forms, such as ourselves, have this thing called consciousness that somehow emerged out of not even unconscious, but just no aconscious matter. It's called the hard problem, as you'll no doubt know. And how you can account for that strong emergence is a major problem. For myself, I actually prefer a different account of cosmic development, which isn't so much about emergence, but it's about return. Again, I get this from Owen Barfield, and he thought of the shape of the U rather than maybe the rising line, a sort of progressive line of emergence. And his idea was that actually in the divine realm, in eternity, in the divine consciousness, everything already is fully actualized, and that what we experience in our lives and in the lives of the universe is potential becoming actualized. So the idea here is that you don't need to rest on a strong emergence, but rather you turn to a notion perhaps of revelation, or appearance or realization. And it's the, as Plato put it, Plato would have been in this school, time is the moving image of eternity. And the U works for Barfield because this can happen over expansive periods of cosmic time. 13.7 billion years of return is what the physicist tracks when they're a cosmologist. But even momentarily or day by day, certainly, we can know ourselves about how we might feel a kind of unity with all things, a connection with all things in one moment, then we fall away from that, but then we can return to that as well. Or time. Someone in the comments mentioned this idea about time being of supreme value, and perhaps part of the reason for that kind of intimation is that we know that time, in its various ways that we experience it, is ultimately returning us to the eternity from which it came. The eternity of the present moment. And so I like that notion of return kind of over emergence. But emergence is much talked about because certainly within the standard story of modern physics and the universe story as it's sometimes told, it seems, at least at first pass, that the universe is emerging in this steady progression until you realize that it's not just weak emergence you need to really make that story stand up, but strong emergence too. And you get these notions like the problem of consciousness, or as someone just put absolutely rightly in the chat there, something can't come out of nothing. If consciousness didn't just exist before, but wasn't even sort of conceivable before, that really strong sense of nothingness, how does something come out of that? An old problem that goes right back to Parmenides, the pre-Socratic.
Mark, I wonder, do you know the work of Otto Scharmer on Theory U? I don't know if there is a
No,
connection.
I don't.
Yeah, I have no idea if Otto Scharmer read Owen Barfield, but Otto Scharmer's work is about kind of tarrying in the U as a place of, kind of mystery and potential insight as well. So I just wonder, and there in the chat we have a mention of the kind of tuber shape and the kind of flowering of the tree that comes above it. So I want to come on to Gothic and the word goth, which we had a minute or two ago, but just my 2 cents worth on emergence. First of all, it's surprising, isn't it, that emergence feels almost like the opposite of emergency, even though it's practically the same word. Emergence feels soft, liminal, veiled, almost poetic, whereas emergency is kind of startling and acute and frightening and all those things, the siren that accompanies it. And actually, that poetic quality of emergence, just to pivot entirely to a different realm, it made me think of um, one of my books is on modern poetry, and while I was doing research on that, I asked myself, what's the most poetic word in the English language? And I sort of thought of Tennyson in particular, because Tennyson's work's so very poetic, for want of a better word. And he comes up with words like gloaming, the gloaming, which is a sort of crepuscular state between sort of light and dark. And I think somebody somewhere argues that the word fade or fading is one of the most poetic words in the English language, and emergence is like a anti-fading, or fading is like a de-emergence, if you like. Darkling is the word that I came up with in that book I was working on, which is darkling is something which may or may not emerge. It's sort of in that liminal, penumbra, I suppose, between light and dark. But just on the word Gothic, it reminded me Nietzsche. Nietzsche was a philologist, an etymologist, before he became known as a philosopher. And in one of his early works, he remarks on the etymology of the word Gothic, which comes from, I think, Middle High German, gießen, which means to gush. We get the word gush. I think they're connected etymologically with the word Gothic. And I can't remember exactly how his commentary goes, but I think he's pretty appalled by the Gothic, because the Gothic is suggestive of things that gush and that are excessive, or kind of dehiscences that appear from nowhere. And if you think of Gothic imagery, a lot of it is quite excessive. It sort of comes with a kind of looming presence, sort of out of nowhere. And that I would have associated. I don't think Freud writes about it directly, but Freud has this very famous essay on the uncanny, or the unheimlich, the unhomely, as it's known in German. And I think probably there is something about the Gothic which fits with the notion of the uncanny. Certainly, there's quite a lot of the uncanny in the Gothic, and there's quite a lot of Gothic in the uncanny. And Freud's definition of the uncanny is that it's the return of the repressed. So we find things uncanny when those things which should have been suppressed and maintained, secreted in the unconscious, suddenly find a way of breaking through, like a mad woman in the attic or the beast in the cellar or whatever it might be. And I think the Gothic has a similar sort of quality to it. It's perhaps something that's not civilized. And Kate, you made this nice comment about lunch being a civilizing thing that we do based on that Rowland Barthes thing. The Gothic is almost the opposite of the civilized, even though it's developed its own form and sort of quite formal structure in a way. If you think of Gothic movies or Gothic literature, they do seem to follow a set of a typology, if you know what I mean. So that's a couple of thoughts about the Gothic.
Hey, look, let me just leap in that because, and perhaps also just to say, if you're just joining us, then comments, words in the live chat are what we're picking up on and riffing in our exchange here at Philosophy Slam, live for the first time on YouTube. But Robert, that's so interesting what you say there about Gothic, because two atheists not liking the Gothic, Freud and Nietzsche, whereas William Blake, for one, loved the Gothic, and in particular loved the Gothic in contradistinction to the Baroque, which he thought was dead because it was all about measurement and proportion and ratio, rather than the Gothic, which does have this living quality, this emerging quality, gushing up, springing into life, which Blake associated with the imagination. And for him, the imagination is this co-creative function that in the human imagination, it springs up from within us, connects with that which is around us, and in a kind of resonance and harmony, sprouts and flourishes, not just to reveal reality to us, but also to enhance and develop reality as well. And he felt that that was the heart of the Gothic imagination that led to things like Gothic cathedrals. I mean, it's perhaps why, though, they can seem quite creepy or uncanny, because you realize that in a Gothic building, there's a representation of a life that's beyond your own, cosmic life in a Gothic cathedral. It's very much the purpose of a Gothic cathedral was to awaken the individual entering it to the life that's around them, as well as the life that's within them. But that is very striking that Nietzsche and Freud were wary of the Gothic or even actively disliked it, whereas the theistic William Blake, who felt that the point where the human and the divine meet is known no more keenly than in our imaginations, loved the Gothic.
Yeah, I want to come on to the power of poetry, which just came up in the chat there. But just on the imagination, the romantic imagination. I know, Mark, you're working on that territory at the moment. I think you're writing a book on Blake at the moment, aren't you? Or trying.
Thinking about it.
Yeah, I think probably needs thinking about before launching in. But it reminded me, are you familiar with Coleridge is a definition of the imagination?
Yeah.
I'll just to share that with people. Coleridge has two notions of the imagination. He says there's a secondary imagination and there's a primary imagination. The secondary imagination is the one we're all familiar with, where you kind of make shapes in the mind, basically. And Coleridge describes that as the SM plastic imagination. So plastic in the sense that it gets molded and produces shapes upon shapes, and it was kind of alchemical in its own way, actually, I suppose, transformative of material into something new. But he also had this much more formidable, really theological definition of the imagination that he calls primary. And if I remember it right, he says the primary imagination is the repetition in the finite mind of the eternal act of creation in the infinite I am. What on earth does that mean? If you sort of disaggregate and turn it around and try and render it in ordinary prose, what he's saying is God is the infinite I am, and his eternal act of creation is what is all around us. And when we tune into our highest forms of imagination, which are acts of creation in themselves, we are basically repeating God's founding gesture of creation, creating the world, basically. So the highest form of imagination is a godly repetition of the act of creation made by God. And secondary imagination is the one we're more familiar with. And we just had this thing, what's the difference between imagination and fantasy? fantasy, sometimes spelt with a PH, generally tends to be, in my definition anyway, fantasy. If you think of the word phantasmagoria as well, these are things which sort of come towards us kind of out of nowhere, summoned unwelcomingly sometimes out of nowhere. Even where fantasies are positive, they tend to be kind of reached from outside. Whereas I'd say imagination perhaps is more of an inner property, but you could argue that the other way around as well. I think.
I mean, just to add that a corollary of Coleridge's definition, which is it's a fantastically useful distinction actually, is that you can tell when something is imagination, not fantasy, because it lasts and because it takes you somewhere. So I don't know, someone like Einstein, Albert Einstein, hugely valued the imagination and said it was given to human beings for a purpose. And the reason is because a successful imagining, such as he did when he imagined traveling on a light beam, can take you an enormously long way. In fact, even overturn all sorts of previously accepted assumptions. In his case, special relativity. Whereas if it had just been a fantasy, it might have amused him for an hour or two, but wouldn't have gone anywhere at all. And so it's a really good way to discern the difference between your own fantasies or imaginings. Do they live with you? Do they open up reality to you? Do they take you to a different place? And sometimes, actually, even in psychotherapy and mental health, when people are caught by their imaginings and they just repeat, ad infinitum, you can call that fantasy, and it's trapping. Whereas you listen out for the moments where a new imagining comes in and it has that more expansive, opening quality, and you leap on it as the psychotherapist and say, no, let's stay with that. Let's see where that takes us, and it can become a personal practice, of course, as well. Developed by a steady sense of being able to meditate. I was going to move on, but do you want to pick up on more?
Yeah, I want to come on to the power of poetry, but also just to remind people, if there are things on your mind, do just pop them in the chat, whether it's a comment on what we've already covered, or whether it's a new topic entirely. And it can be entirely frivolous as well. We don't have to be so serious, even though we're talking about the Gothic and fantasy and death and all these things. The power of poetry was one of the phrases in the chat box, and I mean, in a sense, that phrase is dogmatic, isn't it? It assumes that poetry has a power, but I would agree that it does. And for me, the power of poetry can be derived or understood by contrasting it with the opposite, if it's an opposite, prose or narrative. What's the difference between the two, other than superficial differences like poetry might rhyme, for example, or it tends to be shorter, or it's set off against the margins of the right hand side of the page, and so on. So there's some empirical differences, obviously, between narrative and prose, or prose and poetry. My definition is essentially that poetry can do without narrative, do without story, and still be poetry. Whereas narrative can't do without story and still be story. So that's the difference for me, that poetry can exist without any narrative element. Now, when we think of the origins of poetry, we think of Homer in particular. It's a very narrative style of poem. So, it's not as if poetry can't be told, particularly in the oral tradition, in a narrative mode. But for me, and maybe this is me being dogmatic, what makes poetry poetic is the fact that it can exist just as image, essentially, without an accompanying before, now, and after, without a then this and then the other, without a he said, then she said. And this is why I think the poetry of the early 20th century, associated with a school called Imagism, and particularly with Ezra Pound, I mentioned T.S. Eliot a moment ago, but Ezra Pound, I think for me is a sort of good, and I think Ezra Pound was probably sort of trying this, is a good instantiation, if you like, of something essential about poetry, which is that poetry can exist as pure image, which is why that school was called the Imagists. His most famous poem was boiled down, it's only 2 lines. It's these faces, some images of these faces in the metro, petals on a wet black bough. No, that's it. There's no story. You can imagine the scene. There he is in the Paris subway. There we are in Paris again. So you can imagine narrative around him, but really he's taking us straight into the simile. The image of these faces on the metro, petals on a wet black bough. That's the whole poem, just two lines. And that for me gets to what the power of poetry is, or when poetry leans on its power, leans on its solely poetic power, as opposed to leaning on the power of prose or narrative. Anyway, that's my kind of working definition anyway.
Yeah, look, I want to pick up a bit on poetry and linking perhaps to the collective unconscious, which someone put in the chat kind of a little while back. And also, I've noticed that someone put in light and Jesus. We just had slumber. For those of you just joining, put words in the chat. Robert, should we put a time we're going to stop? I noticed we're going for 40 minutes now, because that can encourage the straggler to put a final comment in the live chat as well. Should we say we'll finish at 50 minutes?
Sure, let's do
Okay.
that. Yeah.
So
I know
look,
you want to do that, Mark, because you're a psychotherapist and you're always on the clock.
I know.
You don't want to
After
carry
50
on
minutes,
talking when you're not being paid. You say,
I know. Well, no, it's, if you go over 50 minutes, then you start asking what's going on here. Is there some craziness coming into the room or something? Anyway, look, we've got ambivalence and reconciliation. You see, immediately it produces a comment or a word. So we made a note of that. But look, poetry and the collective unconscious. So, collective unconscious, Carl Jung's coinage, the idea that it's not just what we're personally unaware of, maybe through repression, as Freud said, that has an active element in our life, but it's what we share by virtue of being born. And it's often overlooked that Carl Jung was deeply influenced by Charles Darwin, and that notions of evolution and being born into an already ancient soul, meaning life form, collective unconscious, was a very important idea for Carl Jung. But I wonder whether language can be linked to the collective unconscious as well, because language is not something that we make up. We cooperate with it if we're lucky, and we're able to use it in order to express things for ourselves. But language often speaks us quite as much as we speak language. Perhaps this is what the poet is discovering, that by experimenting with putting words together in a certain kind of way, even just flipping the order of words on a line, something new might be revealed. And this is certainly what Owen Barfield thought, that the power of poetry is to release what he called the soul of words. And the idea is that nearly all of language, actually he said all, is associated with metaphor. But metaphor can cease to seem like it's doing that communicative channeling quality, taking us further into reality when the metaphor dies, becomes a dead metaphor. And that part of the challenge for the poet is maybe in some contexts rediscovering the life in an otherwise dead metaphor, but at other times using words in order to explore how they can open us onto more reality by making their soul move from what was unconscious into a conscious awareness for us. And so poetry has this revelatory quality. And Jung actually thought that in some ways, that's just one aspect or one way of modeling how the whole of reality works, which he called synchronicity. And he felt that all the dynamism, all the action, all the unfolding, and also destructive potential in reality works through this notion of synchronicity, which is a harmonization or a dissonance, is an evocation or a rejection of reality. And that the subsection of synchronicity, which we call cause and effect, is just synchronicity that takes on particularly mechanical kind of qualities. But language, of course, is not mechanical. It has a structure, a grammar, but nonetheless, its incredible flexibility, infinite potential, is because it works through making these synchronous kind of resonances and harmonizations, which the poet knows supremely well. And incidentally, I think is why, so far as we know, other animals don't have language, but they have locutions. Locutions would be using signs or noises in order to signify something, but it's this much more mechanical notion, useful, no doubt, to say the food's here or warning about that. But language is something else entirely because of this immense fluidity of association that it has, synchronously drawing out from the collective unconscious into our conscious lives, which, we humans and the poet above all others perhaps loves.
Okay, so we've got only a few minutes left, and we've already got quite a lot. Just, I noticed a man joined from Germany. It reminded me, as you said, language speaks through us of Heidegger's famous phrase, die Sprache spricht, language speaks us. Um, slumber, just to touch on, since we're talking about German philosophers, the most famous use of the word slumber is in the translation of Kant's first critique of the Critique of Pure Reason, where he talks about the necessity for us all to awake from our dogmatic slumbers. He said, a lot of philosophers say this. They basically say it's a bit like a plumber who comes along and says, "What cowboy's been doing this then?" All philosophers try and diss the job done by the previous philosopher. So Kant says, philosophers have all got it wrong so far. We've just been in our slumbers for centuries and centuries. We need to wake up to the fact that we'll never actually grasp hold of reality, or the thing in itself, as he says. We'll only ever be able to apprehend it through our mind. So there's always going to be one remove from us. But it made me also want to connect to this thing. There was a phrase there, mathematics is consciousness. I'm going way off piste here because I'm entirely innumerate, unlike Mark. But one thing I have retained, I think, from a little bit of study around this is that there is a philosophical tradition, and philosophy of mathematics would be one of them, which, and this refers to Plato as well, Mark, which perhaps you can help with, which says that actually mathematics, or certain laws of mathematics, are transcendental in the sense that they precede our consciousness of them. So yes, mathematics, consciousness, sure. And particularly one has to be very conscious to do hard sums, like in Daniel Kahneman has this famous experiment where he asks people what's 2 plus 2 as they're jogging past. They say it's 4. Then he asks them what's 13 times 1,689. They all have to physically stop to try and answer the question because they have to mobilize their consciousness to answer the question. But anyway, the point being, maybe mathematics in its purest form in terms of pure laws, like 2 plus 2, for example, equaling 4, maybe that precedes all consciousness. Maybe it is the ultimate a priori. It will never change. It will always be true. Doesn't need to be demonstrated again and again because it will never vary. It's just a given. It's neither, well, it's not even unconscious, actually. It's just one of those few things in the world that perhaps we can rest on. And, philosophers love looking for certainty. Perhaps it is one of the few certainties that we can finally cleave to.
I mean, this was the famous collapse of Bertrand Russell and Ian Whitehead's attempt to prove all mathematics from within mathematics, and even something as basic as addition, they realized they couldn't prove from within mathematics. That seems to have this given quality, and so they gave up on their task. But I mean, actually, the psychoanalyst Matti Blanco is someone who's used certain qualities of mathematics to track conscious and unconscious life, and in particular the qualities of infinity, which you can encounter in unconscious life. And he talks about how there's sort of small infinities and large infinities in maths. So the infinite set of natural numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and so on, is contained within a larger infinite set, which would be all the fractions that come in between the natural numbers as well, but are still numbers. And he thought that that's how our own unconscious might sit within the collective unconscious. That whilst our own unconscious can, go off potentially in all sorts of directions without end, as you might notice in your dreams, if you ever wonder how on earth your dream came up with that's at least probably at first pass the infinite nature of your personal unconscious, but it's within the infinite nature of the collective unconscious, which is all those personal unconsciouses and everything else besides added together. So he used set theory to try and model how consciousness and unconscious works. One link, at least, between mathematics and consciousness. I wanted to not lose a comment, a word, a request put in a little while back: light and Jesus.
You would.
Two things close to my heart.
Mark, I should just say, terrible psychotherapist that you are, you do risk running over the 50 minutes now.
I know, but we can leave things hanging, and then that means people want to come back more. That's why they come back for the next session.
Okay.
So look, light and Jesus. This word light, I mean, it's very much related to what we've been talking about actually this evening, that it has this outer referent, the light that comes from the sun, electromagnetic radiation. But I think the reason why we use the word light rather than just sitting around talking about 450 nanometers of wavelength, hitting us when we see something red, is because electromagnetic radiation has this inner aspect to us, which is the same as the light we feel when we understand something, when we're illuminated, when we feel warmth, effulgence. And so, as William Blake would say, when you look at the sun, you don't just see a physical object emitting radiation in the sky. You actually encounter a living experience, subjective experience, and that's why the word light applies both to the sun and to illumination when you're contemplating, or enlightenment when you wake up to more and more realize things. And of course, Jesus then uses this phrase, "I am the light of the world," because whatever else the incarnation might mean in Christianity, it certainly means a waking up to this inner dynamic, which ultimately is divine. So I almost got that within the 50 minutes striking. We're going over slightly now.
We're going over slightly. And we will draw things to a close, but just also to acknowledge the extra comments which we haven't touched on. This dogma about animals being less intelligent than human, I will argue with Mark about that separately. But thank you all. As I said, this has been our first experiment really doing this. Mark and I have done Philosophy Slam in lots of different contexts, online and offline, but this is our first YouTube live go at it. Our plan is to now do them more regularly. So I hope we'll see you again. Please do tune in next time. We'll let you know when that is. And we'll also kind of gigging, basically, I suppose is the idea. Particularly if you're in London, you can come and see us. We're gigging around various comedy clubs, like a sort of garage band. Mark's going to get his van and we'll have roadies. But yeah, thank you very much. And thanks, Rob, for your comments. Thank you, Hushton Afunichte. All of you.
Yeah, look, that's really encouraging. Maybe just add those thanks. That I'm glad that you've enjoyed it. So watch out for another one coming up. Sign up either to, I have a list on my website, markvernon.com. Robert, I guess you have ways of signing up as well.
Exactly. Yeah.
Or on my YouTube channel. We'll certainly use this YouTube channel again, and do this premiering feature so you can see when things are coming up. But look, thanks to you, Robert, as well. It's been enjoyable as ever. We never know where these things are going to go.
No, exactly.
I always learn something new, have another person to turn to, Otto Schirmer in this case. Yeah. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, everybody. See you again next time. Thanks from Houston.